When I was 13 years old, my mom and dad told me that they were sending me to summer camp for 2 weeks. I was a real homebody when I was that age, and I guess sending me to camp was their way of forcing me to develop social skills before I ended up with some kind of anxiety disorder or something. Looking back, I see why they did what they did. No parent wants to see their kid grow up some weird loner who ends up socially stunted and resentful of the world. I guess attending camp that summer really did make me a little bit more confident and able to handle people, but it definitely wasn't in the way they were expecting. To say I wasn't keen on attending the summer camp might be the understatement of the century. When my parents told me, I almost burst into tears right then and there. I promised that I'd do whatever it took to keep them from sending me to some wilderness torture for 2 weeks, that I'd improve my hygiene and try to be more sociable. But they weren't looking to bargain with me. They were giving me an order. I was going to summer camp whether or not I liked it, and if they had to drag me kicking and screaming onto the waiting bus, so be it. I'll be honest, I cried myself to sleep on the night before the departure day, and I was fighting back tears on the drive out to the bus that would eventually take us to camp. It was only when I was on the bus with the other kids that I was certain I wouldn't cry again, and even then, I think it was only because I was frozen in terror at being in the presence of a bunch of screaming teens. A trio of kids actually asked what my problem was, and all I could do was just sit there, gripped with fear as they began to discuss if I was special. It was completely humiliating, and I actually wondered if there was any way I could escape during a break at a roadside rest stop or something. But then, where would I go? What would I do? It was the very definition of being stuck between a rock and a hard place, and obviously, I chose the hard place over the rock. The first few days of camp were tough to say the least. I barely spoke to anyone, hated the food, and the activities were my idea of hell. I guess I have to say that I was spoiled in that respect, having eaten my choice of foods while sleeping in my very own bedroom, all as an only child. So the realities of eating fairly crappy food while sleeping in a cabin that slept 6 were a devastating shock to the system. My anxiety was bad enough during that first week, but it was particularly intense during meal times, and that was all down to the fact that the boys and girls camps shared a catering facility. It wasn't all the girls that made me so anxious either. It was one in particular, a girl named Alexandra. She was the prettiest girl I'd ever laid eyes on. Popular, smart, graceful, and confident. I spent almost all of lunch and dinner time staring in her direction, except of course when her gaze turned my way. Then I'd just stare into my dinner tray, hoping she hadn't spotted me looking at her. I somehow said twin prayers that she'd come waltzing up to me to say hello, while also hoping that she'd stay far away, that I didn't become some bumbling, red-faced idiot in front of her. Only one prayer was answered, and it made for one of the most nerve-wracking moments of my life. I'll never forget how sweet her voice sounded from up above me, how she asked if it was okay if she could sit with me for a few moments. I completely failed to give her an answer, but she was confident enough to just smile, giggle, and sit down opposite me, recognizing that I wanted to bask in her presence more than anything else in the world. I only managed to compose myself enough to speak once she started asking me my name and where I was from and that kind of thing. Hearing how curious she was about me and seeing the jealous looks of some of the other boys in the cafeteria, that was the first big confidence boost I'd ever gotten in my life. It didn't exactly tip me over the scales or anything. I was still socially backward and incredibly nervous, but for the rest of the day, it was like I was floating on cloud 9. The same thing happened at dinner the following evening, with Alexandra coming over to talk to me about this and that. Only that time, I actually managed something of a complete conversation. And then, towards the end of my first week, when I'd actually managed to buddy up with 2 other fairly geeky, socially awkward guys, she finally asked me the fateful question. Alex walked up to the table I was sitting with my 2 friends at and asked me if I wanted to meet her down at the swimming lake that evening before lights out. Now, as you can guess, something like that was completely and utterly forbidden by camp rules. The girls and the boys were not allowed to fraternize outside of permitted activities, or in the cafeteria, but then that's what made it so doubly special for me. She obviously liked me enough to risk getting sent home early and completely in disgrace, too. There was definitely a time when an opportunity to get sent home early would have been something that I'd have jumped on, but after meeting and talking to Alexandra, I didn't think that I ever wanted to go back home at all. The risk made it exciting, thrilling even, and as nervous as I was about meeting her in private, I told her, of course, then plotted how I'd make my way down to the lake without being spotted by any counselors. When the time came, my buddies wished me luck, gave me some advice on how to keep it cool and play it smooth. Then I set off down towards the lake to meet Alexandra. When I arrived, my heart sank when I saw that she was nowhere to be seen. I was convinced that she wouldn't show, that I'd gotten all my hopes up for nothing, but I was also terrified to just leave in case she showed up a little late and got the impression that I wasn't interested in her. I stayed for 5 minutes, then 10, then when I eventually heard someone approaching along the trail. Then, who should emerge from the trees but the object of my affections, Alexandra, and she was carrying 2 towels. As we talked, I was this mix of nervous and excited and terrified and joyous, but above all, it felt like some kind of victory. I could be sociable. I could date pretty girls. I could probably even be one of the popular kids if I put my mind to it, I thought. That might sound like my ego was inflating to dangerous levels, and you'd definitely be right about that. In fact, by the time Alexandra had actually showed up, it had inflated to the point where I couldn't see how our little meetup could possibly go wrong. And when she suggested we strip down to our underwear and go for a little swim, I was completely blinded by puppy love that I didn't stop to think how that might not be the best of ideas. We did strip down to our shorts, then edged off the dock and into the water. The water was cold, but that was a godsend in a way because then I could pretend that I was shaking just because of how cold it was and not because I was absolutely overwhelmed with nerves at being in my underwear with such a pretty girl. We swam around for a while, trying to keep as quiet as possible, and at some point, Alexandra brought up that she loved swimming and that she swam competitively for the private school she attended back in Burlington. She told me that she could hold her breath for just short of a minute, that it was a record at her school or something like that, and asked if I wanted to see her prove it. I was happy to watch her do just about anything at that point, so of course I said yes. And when she sank under the water, I counted up to 52 seconds until she emerged, gasping for breath. I was beyond impressed. 52 seconds is an incredible feat, especially for a girl of her smaller stature. Then, she asked how long I could hold my breath for. I told her I didn't know, but I was only too happy to duck under the water so she could count how long I could hold it for. I remember ducking under the water and hearing her muffled sounds of counting loud in that sweet lyrical voice of hers. I counted along with it in my head, feeling my lungs beginning to burn for air as the seconds ticked over. But then, she suddenly stopped counting, right as I heard something enter the water next to me. I kicked my legs to push myself back to the surface so I could check out whatever or whoever it was, and that's when I felt a hand on top of my head, pushing me down and keeping me under the water as I tried to resurface for air. I remember opening my eyes to see that Alexandra was no longer in front of me, so whoever was keeping my head under the water was either behind me or above me on the dock. I began to panic, reaching up to pull the hand off my head, but I couldn't do it. I don't think I've been able to drag it off my head at the best of times, and I was always a fairly weak kid and the grip was strong. But then, since I was dangerously low on oxygen, it was completely impossible for me to even budge it. Within a couple more seconds, I could actually feel myself starting to black out. My lungs were on fire. It got harder and harder to struggle against the force pushing me down, and there came a moment where I actually thought to myself, I'm gonna die. The thought caused another spur of panic to run through me, but then after that, and this is the very final thing I remember before I must have passed out, was this weird feeling of peace and acceptance. I wasn't panicking anymore. I just sort of gave up trying to fight the feeling. Then, although I don't exactly remember it, I guess I just let myself drift off into oblivion. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the dock, coughing up water while an adult voice was asking me if I could hear them. I was still in a daze, and in that moment, I couldn't remember what had happened to me. I was just all confused and kind of sleepy. Then as I looked around, I saw Alexandra, crying while one of the counselors tried to comfort her. It was only then that I actually remembered the hand holding me under the water, how I'd gone from the happiest I'd ever been to thinking I was going to die. I had no idea who'd actually held me under, but Alexandra did, and her guilt had her fessing up to the counselor pretty quickly regarding who it was. Apparently, the whole thing had been an elaborate prank to screw with the nervous, overweight kid, but she had no idea that they were going to try to literally drown me out on the lake. From what I gathered, she'd panicked as soon as she saw them keep me under the water so long and had rushed off to get a counselor so they could stop it from happening. The EMTs and the cops showed up not long after I was taken into the head counselor's office, and as you can imagine, it became a huge deal. What was intended to be just some dumb, cruel prank had turned into what the cops were calling attempted murder. The kids did end up getting arrested and taken away from the camp that same night, and the kid who actually held my head down ended up going to juvie for a couple of years, believe it or not. Mom and Dad came to pick me up the next day too, and Mom gave the head counselor an earful about seeing them in court before basically shoving me into the car. I didn't cry when I went off to camp, but I cried having to leave it. It was a whole mix of emotions too. Happy to be leaving a place where I almost died, but sad to be leaving my first real friends behind, and sad to be leaving Alexandra behind too. I know she was the crux of the prank against me, and don't get me wrong, I definitely felt bitter about that. But she also cared enough to run to get help when she realized that they were trying to actually hurt me. I can't tell you how much that meant to me, and looking back, I do realize how crazy that sounds. But in my dumb 13-year-old brain, that was all the evidence I needed that she did actually like me in some way, even if it wasn't the way I wanted. In a bizarre way, nearly dying at that camp turned out to be one of the best things to ever happen to me. I realized that the worst thing in the world, death, wasn't actually all that bad a concept. When it comes to actually facing it, there comes a point of acceptance and peace, and after that, nothing really scared me anymore. I knew I could make friends. I knew I could be brave, and so the things that I thought I never could, like talk to girls or learn to skate, and I actually ended up losing a few pounds from actually going outside and socializing with the new friends I made at school through skating. The only big negative that came from it was my fear of deep water. I haven't gone swimming since that day, and the idea of going on a cruise or being out on a boat honestly makes me sweat with fear. Like I said, going to that camp helped me get over my social anxieties in a big way. It came at a cost, I suppose, but I still weirdly am glad I endured the whole experience, because now I'm not scared of that one thing that grips everyone else and sometimes dictates their whole lives. I'm not afraid of death, and I guess that helps me live a little more than others.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
Back in the September long weekend of 2011, me and my nephew took my 2 children, along with 3 of their friends, to our cabin at a nearby lake for the weekend. Our family has owned the cabin since they moved to Canada in the 1950s. It's located in a very rural area of Alberta. Earlier on the day in question, all 5 kids had been out of the woods, enjoying a game of tag. Well, not long after they started playing, One of the kids came running to tell me that there was a man wearing a gray shirt crouched in the bushes, and he was watching them play. As you can imagine, I was pretty concerned at this point, and I quickly went to check it out as calmly as possible. At this point, the rest of the kids also said that they had seen a man watching them. I went looking around for the man, but he was gone, and the dense bushes made it even more difficult to find him. At this point, I thought getting away from the cabin for a while might take everyone's mind off of the strange events. So we all packed up the car and we went to the beach. When we got to the beach though, there were police cars and emergency personnel all crowded at the beach and throughout the small town. We later found out that apparently 2 people had actually drowned in the lake that day. And in the end, going to the beach wasn't the distraction we had hoped for. Upon returning to the cabin at around 7 p.m., we ate food, the kids played, and we all set up beds in one room for peace of mind after the really strange events. Once the kids were in the room for the night, I went downstairs to the living room, which has a really large deck coming off of it, facing towards the woods. There's a sliding patio door leading onto the deck. My nephew and I were just chatting, when we then heard a tapping noise coming from the back deck. At first, we didn't really think anything of it, but the noise just got louder and way more aggressive, as if it were coming closer. My nephew, who was in his early 20s at the time, came with me. I don't think I mentioned this, but I was a woman in my early 30s at the time, and we went to go check out where the noise was coming from. At that point, we saw a man wearing a gray shirt tapping an axe on the deck. I recognized the man as an ex who we have a restraining order against, and as soon as he saw my nephew, he took off. I immediately called the RCMP, which is the police, and within about 10 minutes, 3 units then showed up with their guns drawn. Thankfully, all the children were sleeping undisturbed in the bedroom upstairs. The police searched for a while, but they didn't find him, as it was really dark and there was a lot of thick brush surrounding our property. Needless to say, I ended up sleeping in the bedroom with all 5 kids that night. The next morning, we all packed up and left, not wanting a repeat of the previous night's events. Upon returning to the cabin a week or so later, the word "dead" was carved into one of the windows that was facing the woods. It was the summer of 2019, and we had planned a road trip from Texas to New York, as well as surrounding states. Our road trip was going well. We had ventured through some really amazing states and cities. The travel crew consisted of my husband, 2 daughters, my husband's parents, and myself. We're pretty self-conscious of the hotels we stay in, due to having 2 small children. Well, a review of La Quinta was really well in a suburb of Washington, D.C., and thus we chose to stay in that La Quinta. Once we arrived at that specific hotel, we had noticed that the hotel had a really rough surrounding area, despite the entire street being covered with hotels. Radisson, Marriott, True, La Quinta, Days Inn, etc., just to name a few. However, the shopping complexes and the restaurants near that area seemed rough. My family stayed in the car and I went inside the lobby to pay and check in. While I was walking up to the lobby, there was a lady who followed me from my car to the entrance and asked for money. From there on, many red flags were raised. Once I ran inside, I called my husband to drive the car around. We decided to just go ahead and stay, since it was just for one day. We ended up deciding to share a hotel room with my in-laws, as the area around seemed really shady, and I figured it wouldn't be a bad idea to keep some extra people around. Once we checked in, my husband and I went to go grab some pizza for the family. We brought some pizza and just chilled in the hotel room. Not a bad day or night. The next morning, we went to go grab the continental breakfast. After we had breakfast, I stayed downstairs by the car and started putting luggage in the car that was brought down by my husband and his dad. My mother-in-law was upstairs with my 6-month-old at the time, and my oldest, who was 3 at the time, was following my father-in-law and husband. Now, my husband and I always hold both of our kids' hands whenever we walk anywhere, and this wasn't different. My husband was holding her hand. My mother-in-law came down with my 6-month-old in hand, along with my husband and his dad, because they forgot something. We decided that my husband and I would stay down and load up the car. My mother-in-law would hold our youngest, and then my father-in-law would go upstairs with our oldest. So we had continued loading the car, as my husband's parents then went upstairs to make sure our luggage was down. Afterwards, my husband went upstairs to do a final sweep of the room. Suddenly, my husband then yelled that our oldest wasn't with them. I quickly shut the trunk of the car and went into flight mode. I started screaming her name and running around. My husband was now running around on the second floor, knocking on neighbors' rooms, asking and checking. My husband's parents shut down and started crying. See, the hotel we were staying at was 3 floors. So as we're running around, I'm downstairs and my husband's on the second floor, and my in-laws are standing by the stairs staring into space. We also had some pedestrians help us out and run and look around. The area had police and they heard me screaming, so the police had arrived within 1 minute because they heard me screaming for her. The officers also got her description and started asking for a picture. Finally, our oldest came down from the 3rd floor. We didn't check the 3rd floor because all of this happened within about 4 minutes, and we were looking around. We're really thankful we found her. We left that hotel, and now we don't go to any hotel that seems shady at all. We spend the extra money, and we just stay in a nice and secure hotel. We assume she went upstairs because we have stairs in our house, so she went up looking for her dad. However, there was a maid on the 3rd floor who was looking down at us. Her eyes were really emotionless and cold while we were looking. I called the hotel and asked for footage, but we never got anything. We decided to just let it go because our daughter was safe with us. This year, our oldest turned 6. We told her about the time that she got lost, and she actually remembered a couple of pieces about it. She told us that the maid had waved at her and went upstairs. Then she heard me scream her name. Parents, please be careful when you go on a vacation, especially if you bring your kids. My husband and I don't leave the kid's side anymore, and we aren't dependent on his parents. So during my freshman year of college, I had a boyfriend who I had just broken up with, and as a young naive freshman in college, I was broken up about it. This was right around the time that I first met my stalker, Scott. Scott was weird as hell, and I really had no interest in him whatsoever. He was once outside my dorm building, and he asked me a question. It was something along the lines of asking me out. I told him no, and that I had a boyfriend, which was obviously a lie. I then proceeded to move on from that conversation and interaction, and forgot all about Scott. That conversation took place in the fall semester. So right as the year was ending and I was finally back home for the summer, I received a Facebook message from Scott basically saying hi, which then proceeded to tell me that I needed to answer him or he would hurt me. I kid you not, he sent the same exact message over 100 times. Yes, I counted it. It was terrifying, and I called my mom and I told her what happened and how I barely know this guy, and that we only had a 1-2 second interaction. While I'm on the phone, he had started to write more messages, but these messages were different ones. It was as if he was having a conversation with me, but without me actually responding. 1 second he was telling me how much he loved me, and then the next was all about how he wanted to hurt me and how he was going to kill me. As you can imagine, after all that, I blocked him. At that point, my mom made me call the police, who came out and took a report, and they basically just told me to report him to the school. My dad ended up calling my school, and he told them that this guy shouldn't be in the same dorm building as me when I returned from fall semester. But they told him that until he physically hurts me, they can't do that. So until he actually went through with his threats, I had to just wait around and watch my back. So after blocking about 5 different pages from Scott, I didn't hear from him for the rest of the summer. Fall semester rolls around and I didn't see him the first couple of weeks. And then one day, right as I was eating in the cafeteria with one of my friends, he walks up behind me, places a gift bag on my table, and walks away. I tell my friend to throw it away, and she says no, she's gonna open it. I didn't want to open it because he then may have gotten the idea that I liked him, and at that point, he was totally psychotic in my opinion. She opens it up, and it's my 2 favorite candies, which how the hell did he even know that? After thinking about it, a few days later, I remembered that I had a model mayhem profile that stated my favorite candy. He obviously searched the internet for me. Anyways, there was also a letter stating that he was very sorry, blah blah blah. So after that day, it was quiet for a while. I would see him, and he would always stare me down very creepily. You know how you stare out of the side of your eyes? Yeah, that kind of stare. So I decided to leave my school and transfer to another school that spring. After leaving, I received more messages from him, and I blocked profile after profile. He then tweeted me a bunch of random crazy threats, and somehow he had got my mom's phone number. My mom ended up contacting his mother, since that was the number he was calling from, and she found out why Scott was stalking me and sending me threatening messages. First and foremost, his mom said that Scott was 26, which is really crazy to think that they allowed a 26-year-old to live in dorms with 17 and 18-year-olds. I think college apartments should be for 26-year-olds. Heck, I'm 28 now, and I would never live in a dorm room. Anyways, she also found out that Scott had schizophrenia, and when he didn't take his meds, he would hear my voice in his head. Reminder, I only met this guy once. We had a very small interaction, and after that, never even spoke again. How could my voice be stuck in his head? She then proceeded to say that she would make sure he took his medication so that he would no longer contact me. I decided that this was enough and that I needed to get an order of protection against him to have some sort of protection legally. Not that it would make him stay away. It was more of a protection in my head, and I never did hear from him again. So Scott, if you happen to hear this and you know who you are, I sincerely hope that you never contact me again. This happened to me at barely 20 years old. I had just gotten off second shift at my job. A couple of friends who also worked with me asked if I wanted to hang out at the beach. I was planning on going home and ordering a pizza and maybe watching some TV. But it was a Friday night in July, and going to the beach sounded like a good idea. I'm a female, but two of my friends were male. We had worked and hung out together for around 3 years, so I trusted them completely, and I didn't have any worries about going to the beach with them that late at night. We chose a beach/park that was in a safe area of where I grew up. As I turned into the beach access road off to the main road, I thought that I'd seen someone walking in the picnic area. I mentioned it to my friends, but they said they didn't see anyone. So I just chalked it up to a shadow from the full moon. I parked and we then got out and started walking to the sand. The night was warm and breezy. I remember we were laughing at something one of us said, and we were all just really carefree. That is, until we saw him. For context, the beach access road sloped down, curving to the right. The road could be accessed from the back of the picnic area by going through a sloped area of the trees. Now, there was a cemented path that led down the beach, but that was farther away from the picnic area. So this guy chose to keep his balance while fighting his way through sloped trees to get to the road, and I guess to us. And he was fast. The moonlight briefly outlined his physique. He was huge. We immediately whipped around and started running back to my car. And just like a scene in a scary movie, I fell. I didn't care though if I hurt myself or not. So I got right back up and kept on pace. My car was a piece of crap, and the doors didn't lock. This was a good thing that night. We jumped into the car, and I started fumbling in my front pocket to try and find my keys. I got my car started, and I put it in drive. I just barely got my foot on the gas pedal before the guy caught up close enough to punch my trunk. I drove right the fuck out of there like a bat out of hell. We drove to a populated area a few miles away before any of us said a word. I had skinned up my knee pretty damn good, as I ripped a hole in my jeans when I fell. I also had road rash all over my hands. I frequented that beach until I moved to another state a couple of years later, but I never went back there at night again.